Hi,
Hey everybody,
how's it going?
welcome back.
We're doing another live stream. We promised you last week that we would come back.
We this is part 2 of our last episode. So we said that we were going to talk about boundaries versus ultimatums, and we never got to it in last episode. So that's what we're going to do today. Is finish talking about that.
So, what's a boundary?
Good question, Nate. You're the boundary guru.
I would not call myself a guru, but I have studied boundaries
You've
quite a
studied
bit.
them a lot.
And the simplest way to think about a boundary is to think about a fence, the fence for your yard. The purpose of a fence around your yard is to let in the things that you want, like the mailman or your neighbors or friends when they come over to visit, and to keep the things out that you don't want in your yard, like
Right.
your neighbor's dog pooping in your yard, or a criminal, or somebody who would do you harm, or somebody who's just not invited to your home.
Before we dive into this, I just want to recap so that we know why we're talking about this.
Okay.
The last episode, the question that we had talked about, how do you get your spouse on board with improving your marriage? You have all these awesome ideas, you have all these things that you want to try, but whenever you bring it up, it seems like your spouse is a little resistant, or they just don't seem to want to do it as well. So how do you get them on board? We talked about not actively searching for this change, like not constantly bombarding them with that. You'll have to go listen to the other episode to recap,
To get the first half.
to get
of
the first half.
Information. It was really good.
But we mentioned that sometimes when people ask this question, a lot of times the advice they get involves setting boundaries and expectations, although the way that they encourage people to set boundaries oftentimes sounds more like ultimatums.
Sorry.
And so our main goal in this episode is to help you differentiate between a boundary and an ultimatum, because there's a fine line between the two, and you want to make sure that you're not setting ultimatums in your marriage, but instead setting boundaries. So
yeah,
let's go back to talking about what boundaries are.
So your boundaries are the fence that protects the things that are most important to you. Things that are important to you could be your time, they could be your relationships with others, they could be your stress level, it could be your body, it could be the consequences to your actions, it could be your property. There's a lot of things that are worthy of protection inside of your relationships, inside of your life. And all of those things are protected by boundaries. Some of them are physical boundaries, and some of them are spoken boundaries. They're relational boundaries. Mm-hmm. And inside your relationship, if you feel like you're being taken advantage of, or if you feel like your partner might be misbehaving and they're constantly hurting you in the same way over and over again, if you feel like they're checked out of the relationship, if you feel like they're constantly misbehaving, a good thing to check in with is whether or not you have clearly set boundaries within your relationship regarding the area in which you're experiencing pain or frustration or hurt.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the symptoms of maybe a boundary you don't realize that you need, a symptom of that being crossed?
Yeah, some of the symptoms of you having a boundary violation, like if there's somebody in your life who's violating your boundaries, who's not respecting your boundaries, typically what you feel is a sense of resentment, a sense of overwhelm. You're constantly stressed. You are constantly blaming other people for your problems. You oftentimes, people without boundaries say yes to too many things, and then they feel completely overwhelmed and just like exhausted all the time. They're complaining that that their partner is the problem, or that their kids are the problem, or that their bishop is the problem, or everybody else is the problem for asking too much of them. And they have people who struggle to set and maintain boundaries are typically much better at taking care of everybody else and not very good at taking care of themselves. But I would say those are the leading symptoms are like resentment and frustration and exhaustion and burnout. So if you're feeling any of those things right now, it's probably due to a lack of boundaries that you've set in your life.
Do you feel like this is a problem we see a lot in in the church?
I think it's really common in the church because we're taught to say yes to everything. We're taught that it's not okay to say no to a calling or an assignment. We're taught that it's our job to take care of others and help people out. And we aren't taught very often that it's important to take care of yourself first.
I think we hear a lot of this as well, coming from a woman's point of view. Just in primary and in young women's and in Relief Society,
To be selfless.
We're taught to be selfless. We're taught to be almost to the point of self-sacrificing, which I think then it's not necessarily a virtue anymore. It becomes a vice. And
it does you no good to lose your sense of self.
When you become self-sacrificing instead of just selfless, you're no longer doing it from a place of love.
I don't even like the word selfless.
Well, I think
I like the word generous.
Yeah.
So like I see a lot of women particularly, men also fall into this trap, but I feel like women fall into it more frequently. But they give from a place of love and from a place of generosity and from a place of desire to help. And then when they reach that point of burnout, if they become too selfless, if they become overly generous in their boundary, they stop respecting their own boundaries. What happens is they start giving from a place of resentment and a place of like kind of, what's another word for resentment? They're almost
obligation.
Yeah, a sense of obligation. You're giving from a sense of obligation, and nobody wants obligatory love.
Well, and it's almost, I could even say it could be coming from a place of fear. That there's this fear that if I'm not serving others every single time that they ask me, I'm not jumping on every opportunity to serve others, and I'm not giving my all to my children and all to my husband, that there's this fear that we're somehow not measuring up to what we're supposed to be doing. And I 100% and completely relate to that. And I think that in that regards, this whole idea of not setting boundaries in our relationship is specifically, it's a problem you see everywhere in all its different cultures, but it's specifically a problem we have in the culture of the church, I think.
It's something that we see a lot.
Right.
So let's dive into some examples of what a boundary would actually look like. And maybe that will help to clarify whether or not you need boundaries, and if so, how you can start to set them.
Okay.
Is that cool?
Yeah.
So I'm actually pulling some examples today from this book. It's called Boundaries: When to Say Yes and When to Say No, Take Control of Your Life by Cloud and Townsend. It is a great book. It's actually written it's written around the Bible. So not only is there really great just research-based examples of what boundaries are, but also it ties it into religious Christian practices. It has Christian roots. So it's really kind of a really interesting resource. It's really even interesting to learn how God sets boundaries with us, which is fascinating. It covers that in the book.
And if we're trying to be more like God, maybe
we have to learn to set
more
boundaries.
Yeah.
But there's a specific chapter in the book that's dedicated to boundaries within marriage. And one of the first examples is a pretty tame example, but it's a really great example of what a boundary looks like. And the situation is that there's a man who really likes to be on time, and a wife who is chronically late. So it sounds exactly like our marriage.
We'll go into a personal experience in a minute.
This is like a thing that we have argued about on a fairly regular basis in our relationship. Mm-hmm. And this boundaries book has really helped us in setting clear boundaries has really helped us to navigate the issue. So this man had nagged and nagged his wife about her tardiness to no avail. Finally, he realized that he could not change her. He could only change his response to her. So this is not about changing your partner. What it's about is changing your response to your partner.
That's important.
Because trying to change your partner that's an ultimatum. That's manipulation. And we don't want to manipulate our partner. We don't want to give them ultimatums. Like, we don't want to punish them for being who they are. What we want to do is change our response to them so that we can have our boundaries respected. There's a big difference between changing your response and trying to change your partner's response.
And again, that comes back to that question: how do I get my spouse on board? Oftentimes when you frame it in that way, you're going to try and change your spouse's behavior and try and manipulate them into behaving the way you want them to. but that is an ultimatum. Again, we're distinguishing between the difference.
So this man realized that he was tired of suffering the consequences for his wife's behavior. So he decided that instead of him suffering for her consequences, he was going to give the consequences back to her. Because what he realized is that when she chose to be late, what was happening is that he was experiencing the effects of her lateness, and sometimes it even bothered him more than it bothered her. And he just decided, okay, I'm not going to continue to suffer for her lateness. I'm going to let her suffer the consequences for her choice to be late. And this is kind of a scary thing to do. Boundaries can be difficult because they put a little bit of stress on the relationship. Mm-hmm. Things get a little bit worse before they get better most times. So one night they had plans to go to a banquet, and he did not want to be late. So in advance, he told her that he wanted to be on time. And if she were not ready by 6 o'clock, he would leave without her. So there's an important distinction here. He verbalized the boundary. He told her specifically what the boundary was. I'm leaving at 6. And if you want to come with me, you need to be ready by then. So he set a really clear expectation. This isn't something that he just thought in his head. He communicated it to her. She ended up being late, and then he left. And when he came home that night, she screamed, "How could you leave without me?" And he let her know that her lateness was what caused her to miss the banquet, and that he was sad to have gone alone, but he did not want to miss the dinner. After a few more incidents like this, she knew that her lateness would affect her and not him, and she started to change. So then it says, these moves are not manipulative, as the other spouse will accuse. So sometimes what happens when you implement a boundary is that your partner will blame you and say, you're manipulating me, you're trying to punish me, you don't accept me for who I am. They'll say, when somebody has been protected from the consequences of their choices, and then suddenly they're required to face the consequences of their choices head on. Let's put this water bottle somewhere else. It's painful for them, and they haven't ever really experienced that pain before. So their response sometimes is going to be not the happiest one, because people don't like to experience pain.
Let's talk about our personal experience.
Can I finish this paragraph?
Sure.
So these are examples of someone limiting how they will allow themselves to be treated and exhibiting self-control. The natural consequences are falling on the shoulders of the responsible party. So the way this is different from an ultimatum, and we'll go into this more after in this episode, but the way this is different is that a consequence is clearly communicating what you are going to do, and then clearly communicating what the consequence would be if that person doesn't follow through on their agreement, and then letting them suffer the consequences of their behavior. An ultimatum is when you punish somebody for making a specific choice. And one is done with love, and the other one is done, a consequence is done, or not a consequence, a boundary is set out of love and respect for yourself. And an ultimatum is typically done out of frustration, out of anger, and it's a power play to get control over your partner.
And it's usually not a natural consequence.
It tends to not be a natural consequence.
Like a natural consequence of someone being late is that they miss out. That's a natural consequence. Yeah. A not natural consequence would be like,
we're not having sex.
We're not having sex for a month.
Or I'm cutting off access to money to you, or I'm going to stop doing specific chores around the house. So
right. Yeah, that's not a natural consequence. That's a punishment. So this sounds very, very similar to our situation. Like, honestly, we could just insert our names into this and it would be exactly our situation. I have been chronically late since kindergarten. I walked myself to school when I was younger because we lived in the same neighborhood as my elementary school. And I was that little girl that would walk in 20 to 30 minutes late to class. And this was something that was ingrained within me. I almost had anxiety over being on time. Like I didn't like the idea of being early because that meant that I had to talk to people. And that scared me. I was shy. And so if I was late, I didn't have to talk to anybody. Anyways, that is something that carried over into my adult life, and I'm so much better now. I'm no longer 20 to 30 minutes late. It's like maybe tops 5 minutes late, but that's something that we started bumping into very early on in our relationship, that we would oftentimes be late to church. and we'd walk in when we were singing the
Oftentimes
first hymn.
meaning like 3 out of 4 Sundays a month.
A lot of times we were late. We were rarely on time. And this was, when I say me, I was late. Nate was always waiting for me. And he would get so frustrated, and we'd argue about it, and we'd fight about it. And I would say, I'm sorry, I'm really trying hard. But then one day he said, all right, honey, our church starts at 10:30. I'm going to leave at 10:20 to be to church. I'd love for you to come with me. If you're ready, we can go together. If not,
I'll save you a seat.
I'll save you a seat. And at first I was livid over this.
Were you?
The first time he left me, I was so hurt and mad. But again,
And you showed up to church. It's so huffy and puffy.
And I was huffy and puffy, and I wouldn't hold his hand, and I was angry. But I think it's because now I realized it was my own fault. We were shining a light on a natural consequence of my own actions. And I was angry with Nate for making me feel that uncomfortable feeling of me being wrong. I didn't like that. I didn't like that I was wrong. But the more he started leaving on time, he was happier. He was less resentful towards me. And I realized that ultimately this was a me thing.
We didn't have to have the
to
conversation about being late anymore because I was always on time. I felt fine about it.
Right.
And then Angelin would walk in and the bishop would look at me and wink, and I'd wink back, and we'd just be like, yep, it happens sometimes.
But I've been doing so much better now at being on time. Mm-hmm. And now when I'm late, I recognize that it has nothing to do with Nate, and him leaving me has nothing to do with Nate, and everything to do with my decision to be late. And so I like what it says in this book, that it might get worse before it gets better, that it might cause a different kind of argument when you set boundaries with your partner.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it forces your spouse to realize that they are responsible for their own choices. Instead of you taking responsibility for their choices and taking the fall for their choices, like it says, you're putting the consequences back on them. And it's uncomfortable for them. Mm-hmm. Speaking from experience, it's uncomfortable to be like, oh, he's not going to share in this consequence with me anymore. It's all on me. But now it's not really a source of argument anymore.
So in that specific regard, I have stopped rescuing Angelin from the consequences of her behavior.
Yep.
And when you don't have clear boundaries, that's typically what happens is your partner misbehaves, and then you either take responsibility for them, you save them from experiencing the consequences of their actions, and then because they don't experience those consequences, the behavior perpetuates itself. They feel like they can continue to behave in that way and get away with it, and it's going to be totally fine because they've gotten away with it in the past. So you're basically training your partner to misbehave. I don't mean to say like training them like you're training a dog, but by the way that people learn how to treat you by how you allow yourself to be treated. And so setting clear boundaries is basically showing self-respect. It's saying, I respect myself enough to not have to walk into late church every single week and be when it's important to me to be on time. Mm-hmm. It's just a self-respect thing. I don't need to suffer the consequences of your choices every week. And I love you the same. And I would love for you to come with me. And I would love to sit by you and drive with you to church. And if you choose not to be ready when it's time to leave, it really sucks for both of us. Mm-hmm. But I'm not gonna suffer the consequences with you.
Let's talk about another example. I don't think this has really happened much in our marriage. It has happened a little bit, but this is an example I hear a lot of spouses, particularly women, being frustrated when their spouses leave their clothes on the floor and don't put them in the hamper. This is such a common, it seems really silly, but it can be so frustrating when the hamper's right there and yet the clothes are strewn all over the room. An example of a boundary in this situation would be, I will clean the clothes that are in the hamper. And I'm not going to pick up your clothes. If you want your clothes to be cleaned, I'm more than happy to clean them, but I'm only going to clean the clothes that are in the hamper. And then just let those clothes on the floor pile up.
It might drive you nuts.
And it might drive you crazy, and your spouse might get upset. I don't have any clean underwear, or I don't have any clean shirts. And it's just like, well, I will clean the clothes that are in the hamper. That is a boundary. Not, if you leave your clothes on the floor, I'm going to throw them all away. That's an ultimatum, and that's a punishment. You're throwing away someone's clothes. That's not a natural consequence.
But the other, so what you could say to your partner is, if you choose to continue to leave your clothes on the floor, it's completely your choice. I'm totally okay with it. And just know that the clothes that are on the floor are not going to get washed.
Mm-hmm.
So if you choose to do that, that's totally your choice. And if you choose to put them in the hamper, they're going to get washed. And I would love to wash them for you. But I'm not going to allow myself to be treated like a maid who has to go around and pick up your clothes anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's a self-respect thing.
Right.
So you're controlling what you have control over. You're saying, what I can control is I will wash the clothes in the hamper, and I'm not going to be treated like a maid.
Mm-hmm.
And do it with love, not with anger. And say, I would really love to wash all of your clothes, and you get to choose whether or not that happens.
Right.
It's totally up to you.
That is a boundary. Right. And
some people fall into the trap of setting passive boundaries, and passive boundaries are like passive aggression. They are like pouting. Let's see, what else? Withdrawal, like shutting down emotionally. Pouting is a really big one. Nagging. Affairs even can be a really passive boundary. Like having an affair with somebody, like this is the consequence of you not doing this.
So that wouldn't even be a boundary at all. That would be
it's a form of a passive boundary. An active boundary is a boundary that you talk and you say, you communicate what you have going on in your brain, what the expectation is. You communicate what the boundary is, and then you follow up by following through with that commitment. So a passive boundary is one that you don't communicate. You just silently punish your partner.
Mm-hmm.
Or you say, like, the way an affair could be a passive boundary is you're saying, you could say something like, I'm not getting sex from you, so I'm going to go get it somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
Speaking that out loud is completely different. I would never condone that, but it could be an example of
how people would set passive boundaries.
So boundaries need to be communicated first with your words, and then second with your actions.
Mm-hmm. So again, just to recap, one way that you can make sure that you're setting a boundary instead of setting an ultimatum is looking at the consequence and making sure that the consequence is a natural consequence of their actions versus a punishment. That it's something that naturally occurs because of their choices versus something that you're inflicting on them because of their choices. So that would be a good indicator.
Yeah. And one of the things that I love about boundaries is boundaries give you more freedom.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times we think that by limiting ourselves or putting fences up to protect our relationships, what we're doing is we're limiting that. We're putting limits on them, but really you're giving yourself a lot more. You're giving yourself balance.
Mm-hmm.
I look at people who, when you know what is important to you and you know how to protect those things. So maybe I'll just talk about the things that are important to me. The things that are important to me are Angeline. She is number one. My time. And this is something that I really struggle with is I'm very conscious of the amount of time that I get in a day, and I have a lot to do. Running a business, running 2 podcasts, doing a whole bunch of other really important things, managing a lot of relationships, taking care of clients and customers. It's a lot. Like I have a lot of things going on. Plus I have things that I want to do for myself. And so sometimes I realize that I turn into a yes man, and I say yes to like meeting up with people for lunch or taking on a side project, or I just say yes to too many things. And that cuts into my ability to protect my time, both with Angeline and with the things that are like really important to me. So my health is one of those things that requires boundaries. Like I try to work out 5 times a week. It's it's a goal I work towards. And if I stay up too late, I don't wake up at when my 5:30 alarm goes off, and then I don't make it into the gym, and then my whole day gets ruined. And so like one of the boundaries that I try and set with Angeline is trying to get to bed early, trying to get to bed before 9:30. and it's hard sometimes. And when we don't get to bed before 9:30, I feel the consequences, and it takes a big toll on me. So boundaries are all about setting. They're all about protecting the things that are important to you. And when you do protect those things, when I do get to bed early and I do wake up and get my workout done and I do get in the date night and I do eat healthy and I do protect my time and get a really good work day and I don't spend it all on YouTube or going to random lunch meetings with people, I end up being way more effective, way more powerful. I end up getting way more done and having a bigger impact on the world in the way that I want to do it. So sometimes saying yes to too many things can damage your relationship with your family, damage your relationship with your body, damage your relationship with Heavenly Father, damage your relationship with just about anything. And so you need to make sure that you're paying careful attention to the balance,
Right.
to staying balanced.
Right. And it might feel selfish at first to set boundaries just because it's a little counterintuitive to feel like we're taught, well, when you're in the service of your fellow beings, you're only in the service of your God. Well, you also can only serve someone to the degree of which you're capable. And when you are suffocating and buried in responsibility and you feel like you're taking on everybody else's consequences and everybody else's responsibilities and not just your own, it really limits the way that you can help other people.
Yeah.
So some really good indicators that you've set great boundaries in your life is you feel a sense of peace.
When you give from a place of generosity and like because you want to give, not because you feel obligated to give.
Giving fills your soul, it fills your cup versus draining it.
Mm-hmm. You feel energized.
You feel energized. You feel less resentful towards everybody, especially your spouse and your kids. You don't have anxiety every time the bishop asks you to do something because you know that it's okay if you say no sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
You can say no to planning the Christmas dinner if you are overwhelmed with everything else. So boundaries are divine, actually.
I just like to think of the first and second great commandments. The first commandment is to love God, and the second commandment is to love your neighbor as you love yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And the word "as" has more than one definition. It could mean while, like you can love your neighbor while you love yourself, and a lot of times that's the way we think about it. Like, oh, I show my love for myself by loving my neighbor. Like it's just a great way that I can feel the love of God is by serving others. But as can also mean like in the way that. So you love others in the way that you love yourself. And if you don't respect yourself enough to say no so that you can protect what's important to you, then you're also you're probably not showing respect to others. You might have extra high expectations of people. They might disappoint you a lot because you feel like your level of commitment is much higher than somebody else's. But just take into consideration, like, am I loving myself in the way that I love others? And if the answer is no, and there's an imbalance there, then you have something to check in with.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that I also feel like setting boundaries for other people it's actually a service to them because you are now allowing them to level up.
Yeah.
You're allowing them to grow and to learn and to be more self-reliant, because if they've gotten to a place where they're relying on you to take the responsibility for their actions,
yep,
they don't have the opportunity to
grow,
to truly self-reflect and realize the consequences of their own actions, because you are somehow like taking the bullet for them. So they don't know what it feels like to take the bullet for themselves, for their own actions. So
well said, honey.
Yeah, so it's actually really, we like to call marriage, like David Schnarch says, the human growth machine. Are you allowing your spouse to grow?
Or are you stunting their growth and saving them from the consequences of their actions, and then complaining when they're not behaving like a grown-up?
Right.
And complaining when they're not meeting you where you're at, and saying, oh, I just do everything and I take care of everybody. And that's like your sword that you fall on. You play the victim card. Oh, I just do everything for everybody. But then when somebody leaves you in a pinch and they throw you a project and you say yes to it, and you take responsibility for the consequences so that they don't have to meet them, of course they're not going to grow up.
Mm-hmm.
Like, of course your kids are never going to learn the lesson that they need to take care of their homework early if you help them up until midnight, the night that the project is due. And of course, your husband is never going to vacuum the house or take out the trash if every time you ask him to do it and then he doesn't do it immediately, you just go do it himself. He's just going to learn, I don't have to do it.
Mm-hmm.
My wife will take care of it. And so, or vice versa. Like, here's actually some examples of boundaries that you could set.
Go for it.
That would help people take responsibility for their actions. So, responding to maybe a partner raising their voice at you, yelling at you, maybe calling you names, belittling you. A non-boundaried response would be, stop yelling at me. You need to be nicer. You're being a jerk. A boundaried response is, you can continue to yell at me if you want, but I am not going to choose to stay in your presence when you do. So go ahead and keep yelling. And when you raise your voice like this, I'm going to leave and I'll come back when you're ready to talk to me in a nice and kind way.
Mm-hmm.
That's giving them responsibility back for the way that they're behaving you. Another one is maybe your partner has a substance abuse problem. Maybe they're out getting drunk. Maybe they're out taking advantage of drugs or other things. And the non-boundary response would be something like, you got to stop. Like, you got to stop drinking. It's ruining our family. Please just listen to us. It's wrecking our lives. So that's like you making them bad and trying to punish them and guilt them into behaving better. A boundary response would be, you can choose to not deal with your drinking. That's totally up to you. But the next time that you come home drunk, we are going to go over to my parents' house, or we're going to go over to the neighbor's house, and we're not going to keep a secret why we're there. We're going to explain to them why we're there, why we can't feel safe at our own house. And that's totally up for you to choose. But just know that we're not going to tolerate you coming home drunk anymore.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah.
Maybe you have a partner who perpetually looks at pornography, and you've made an agreement in your relationship that pornography is not part of your relationship. So the one response could be to call your partner a pervert, to tell them they're disgusting for looking at pornography, to say, how could you?
Or to say, we can't have sex because you looked at pornography.
Yeah. Or you could say, hey, you can choose to keep looking at pornography, but when you do, it makes, like, I feel sexually disinterested. I don't have a desire to have sex with you when you're looking at images on a computer screen and like getting sexual pleasure from that. So that's your choice. Like, you can choose to continue to look at pornography, but if you do, just know that, like, I'm not sexually interested in you anymore. Mm-hmm. It hurts.
That's taking the responsibility and putting it back on them, and then taking responsibility for your own reactions to that as well.
So those are just a couple of examples. So I would take a look at your life if you feel like, like we said at the beginning of the episode, if you have a partner who you feel like isn't engaging in the relationship, if you feel like you're resentful, if you feel like you're exhausted, if you feel like you're burned out, if you feel like you have no time for yourself, if you feel like you're running on fumes, you have an empty tank, there are some areas in your life where you probably have either a complete lack of boundaries or very weak boundaries. And a really great thing to start practicing is examining in what areas you are saying yes to things that are not very important to you, or you're letting things into your life that are jeopardizing the things that are important to you. And then you need to start creating spoken agreements that are followed up by action. Mm-hmm. And expect that things might get worse before they get better, because people don't like having to face the consequences of their actions, especially if they haven't had to do that before. But just know that if you do it long enough and you persist, one, you're going to feel more peace of mind. You're going to have more energy for yourself. You're going to feel more full. You're going to be giving from a place of generosity when you give. You're going to have more time. You're going to have more great experiences with the people that you love. And the people that you love that you've been saving from their consequences will either, one, level up, or two, they will make the choice to, and essentially what they'll make the choice to do is to continue down the path that they're headed, which is destructive. And they're making the choice to even potentially end the relationship, mm-hmm. which is a scary thing. But if you enable that person to avoid their choices, all you're doing is drawing out the inevitable.
Right.
Like, that's not a reciprocal marriage. A great marriage is one where your partner respects your boundaries and they love you for who you are. And when they see that they're causing you pain, they want to do whatever they can to stop. And if you're in a marriage where somebody refuses to respect your boundaries, who refuses to respect the things that are most important to you, and who wants you to take responsibility for the consequences of their actions, that's not a marriage.
Right.
That's a manipulative and abusive relationship.
And remember, in that regards, we talked about this last time, but
it can be abusive. Most manipulative is probably a better word.
Yeah, manipulative is probably better. But just remember, we talked about last time that if you never give your spouse an opportunity to be trustworthy, you won't trust them. So it's easy to say or to assume that that's how your spouse is going to react.
Yeah.
But unless you give them the opportunity over an extended period of time, you're never going to know. Are they going to level up or not? But just remember that what they do in a week is not going to let you know what they're going to do in 6 months.
Yeah.
So if they're angry and upset for the first week, that's normal. That's how I was when Nate first set this boundary of being on time. But after several months of him giving me the benefit of the doubt and letting me simmer in it, it's been amazing for our marriage. And it's helped me to level up and take responsibility for my actions.
It's also worth noting that as you set boundaries, one of the tools that you're going to probably have to tap into is self-soothing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's hard to set a boundary with somebody, and like it causes a little bit of anxiety because you're changing a system that has been working, not really working, but it's become comfortable.
This is your comfort zone now.
And when you change the comfort zone, when you change the way that you interact with something that has become comfortable to you, it's going to cause a little bit of stress and anxiety. And so learning to breathe into it, to relax, to remember, like, I'm doing this for a good reason. This is for the benefit of me and for my partner, even though it might cause them pain. And to just remember to, like, enforce that boundary that you set. That self-soothing is going to be really, really helpful.
And just as a reminder, these boundaries need to be verbalized.
Yep. So
and
verbalize
not
them,
be unspoken.
back them up with action, and you don't need to nag the boundaries. Like, the laundry example is a great example. Hey, the laundry that gets put in the hamper gets washed. Let them know once. And if you see more clothes piling up, you don't need to let them know again and then again and again, because then you're nagging again.
Mm-hmm.
So let them know once and then wash the clothes. And let the clothes keep piling up, and maybe a second cycle goes through and you wash the second cycle of clothes, and the laundry keeps piling up, and then wash the third cycle of clothes, and just keep breathing
until
into
they
it.
no longer have clean clothes.
Until they lose it, and they might have that breakdown where they're like, why don't I have any clean underwear? Where's my clean clothes? And you say, oh, don't you remember when I told you that I only clean the clothes that are in the what is it called?
In the hamper.
In the hamper. I would love to wash your clothes. You just need to put them in the hamper. It's totally your choice. I just smile at them with love and a willingness to follow through on your agreement. And they get to choose. They'll probably go scoop up all their clothes and put it in the hamper, and they might be really angry about it.
They might do it huffing and puffing.
But guess what? The next time around, it's not going to take them 3 weeks. It'll take them maybe 1 week. And then maybe it gets to the point where just every day they're putting their stuff in their hamper, and it works.
Yeah. It's a pretty cool experiment.
Yeah.
You should try it.
I've started taking all of your bathroom clutter, and just like when it creeps onto my side, I just push
He
it over
just
to your
shoves it
side.
over to my side.
And I say, my space is going to be clean and your space can be
This
cluttery.
is the boundary.
There's a physical boundary.
Right.
And eventually you come around and you go, okay, I'll put all my stuff away, and you just take care of it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
My space is clean, which is what I want, and your space is...
And there's no resentment there. There's no, would you just please put your stuff away?
Anyway.
Yep.
I hope that this conversation has helped you maybe consider some ways in which you could make changes that would... Here's the thing that I hope. I hope that maybe some of the frustrations and difficulties that you're facing in your relationship, you have realized are because you're saving your partner from the consequences of their actions, and that by making different choices and setting clear boundaries, it forces them to take responsibility for their actions and not you, which oftentimes will create a really great positive shift in their behavior when they suffer the consequences of their actions.
Right. So if you want to learn more about setting boundaries, you can read this book. They have also written a book specifically for married
you can get
people.
it on Amazon. We'll link to it below.
Yeah, because this is not easy stuff. It's not easy, and so it's nice to have references.
But it's necessary.
It's so necessary. But yeah, thanks for tuning in for another one of our live episodes. We'll have this up tomorrow in podcast form, and we'll also have it uploaded to YouTube. And come find us on Instagram. Please, if you are enjoying the Mormon Marriages podcast, head over to iTunes and give us a review. Giving us a review isn't just so that we can feel nice about it.
That's part of it.
It's nice to get the reviews, but the more a podcast is reviewed, the more it becomes discoverable to other people. So by you leaving us a review, that specifically helps us get the word out there. So
other couples will find this podcast and have their lives benefited from it.
And share it with your friends, share it with your family. And if you have a question you'd like us to cover, please send it to us. Through the blog, there's an area where you can send it to us there, through Facebook, through the Instagram, through email. We get questions. For example, this question has sparked so many conversations. We have like
2 episodes.
We have like 3 other episodes in mind that have come specifically from this question. So we love getting your questions.
Okay. Bye, guys.
Bye.
See you soon. We're going to Thailand next week, so we'll be gone for 2 weeks. But when we get back, we'll have a great episode for you.
We'll have an episode after that waiting for you.
Bye.
Bye.